This is looking at women in the 1920s. I'd like to start by exploring some of the historical context of the 1920s. In many ways, the 1920s are paradoxical. They're considered to be the roaring 20s, very socially, culturally liberal, yet we see an undertone of economic and political conservatism. So, part of the climate of political conservative came about because of the Red Scare after World War One, where anything that was so politically radical or extreme or socialist, communist was considered to be, um, of the Bolsheviks, the Russians, and was not American. It was considered un-American. So that resulted in union membership going down, less participation, less acceptability of unions in the workforce. We also see the 18th Amendment pass, which was the Prohibition Amendment, right? The amendment that temperance movement, the WCTU, had been working towards achieving for so long, right? So a lot of these sort of conservative pinnings of the 1920s in conjunction with the roaring economy that we see as a result of World War One. The same economic production that was causing the United States to be so successful in helping the Allies win the war continued afterwards. So there's an economic boom that we're seeing in production, and consumerism and production are at an all-time high. Looking at female sexuality, here we have an image of what many would consider a typical flapper woman of the 1920s. This is Zelda Fitzgerald. The symbol of the flapper is that she is sort of androgynous, sexual. She drank, she smoked, she was individualistic, she was a consumer, she was daring and unconventional. Unconventional. She did not wear the cinched dress of the Victorian era, very flat lines, short hair, short skirts, wore makeup, which people that wore makeup prior to the flappers were prostitutes. So making makeup more conventional, more normative. And this is a culture of thinness, right? Being very, again, kind of androgynous was sort of the look. So Zelda Fitzgerald sort of sets herself up as the quintessential 1920s woman in that sense, that she set herself against the image of the more serious reformer or career woman that we see in the Victorian or even progressive era. So in some ways, we're seeing in the 1920s that women are sort of losing that kind of female Victorian community, that reform mindedness, that more sort of serious political mindedness that many women activists were working for so long to get the women's suffrage amendment passed. So the flapper woman, Fitzgerald, for instance, is downplaying her maternalism, her morality, and really trying to set herself as an equal in some ways to men. We also see beauty pageants start in the 1920s. There is a greater widespread of makeup doing things for the male gaze, according to feminist historians. 1921, we see the first Miss America pageant, for instance. We also see a growth of scientific experts and the field of psychology becoming more prominent. A lot of this has to do with the growth of Sigmund Freud's studies being published and circulating, right, where he is classifying homosexuality as something that is quote unquote deviant and unhealthy to heterosexuality. It becomes a medical diagnosis to be non-heterosexual. We also are seeing at the same time this really growth of a gay and lesbian culture. In the 1920s, drag balls are being conducted across United States cities. Cross-dressing, gay bars. These are places for people to be experimental or to be out and in the open. So just a growing sort of change and acceptance for some greater deviation from kind of the more older Victorian notions of sexuality. We also see the growth of an adolescent peer culture where working class youth start to develop their own sort of street culture and social clubs. And, the streets really provided a space to be free of supervision from their parents, for young women to act unladylike, to, date. And this was all going on sort of outside of the home because, again, a lot of these urban working class youth don't have the space in their actual home to have this kind of socializing. We also see that clothing for these adolescents was a way for them to experiment with different social status. Some would dress to marry up. Working girls were adopting high culture styles with low culture styles to form their own sort of unique fashion. And in a lot of ways, this sort of adolescent street culture was challenging gender norms. Historians argue whether women's leisure resulted in feminist changes or not. And on the one hand, we see more sexual danger as a consequence of this street culture and less supervision. We also see women starting to commodify their bodies for the male gaze by dressing and wearing their makeup and hair for the attention of male suitors, being something that is really coming about in this time period. In terms of the changes that we're seeing in marriage and family during this time, we really start to see the emergence of what Ben B. Lindsay, who was a judge and a social scientist, called companionate marriage. He said this kind of companionate marriage was better suited for the modern society. And scholars are unsure about how widespread this companionate marriage ideology was. It varied by class, definitely more common in the middle class. But what we start to see is that companionate marriage meant, marrying for love, for friendship, for affection, marrying older, and using birth control to control when you would have a family or start your family. So we also start to see the birth control movement, which really develops in the progressive era, around 1914, become more acceptable in the 1920s. There's definitely various arguments for why women were arguing for the right to have birth control. Some were arguing that it was, women's emancipation to have control over her body and family. Other women were arguing that, poor women actually had the least access and the most reason for wanting birth control, right? Having children became a financial burden. So they should have that choice to limit their family size. And other were arguing that that birth control needed to be available for heredity, that smaller families and raising children under better conditions would equal a better society. And this is where we start to see some of that eugenics movement at play in why some doctors argued that birth control should be legal. The larger conception that feminism is connected to birth control does not become part of the women's movement until the 1960s. But nonetheless, we're starting to see some changes. And the third aspect of companionate marriage was the right to divorce for childless couples. which in a lot of ways was very risque for the time. So we start to see the divorce rates go up. In 1880, 1 in 24 marriages ended in divorce. In 1890, 1 in 12. In 1924, 1 in 7. So those are very significant changes. We're also seeing a decline in the size of a family. Birth rates are down. In 1900, the average the average amount of children people had was 3.6. By 1930, 2.5. So significant decrease in birth rates. We're also seeing that there's an increase in scientific management over children. We're starting to see more hospital births. Midwives are being portrayed as dirty, uneducated. Parents start to turn to the child rearing experts for advice, to social scientists, psychologists, for how to raise children the right way. So it's very much more of a regimented schedule. There's a greater focus on nutrition, extracurriculars. Heavy oversight is required of parents to be quote unquote good mothers and fathers at this time. When it comes to work, there's definitely some modest increases of women in the workplace. Between 1920 and 1930, 1/4 of all women are in the workforce. We also see the emergence of the idealized working girl. She was the glamorized secretary, the white-collar, woman who was seeking magazine advice on how to get ahead, but really without the possibility of moving up in her job. The overarching goal that we see from the idealized working girl is that the goal is to find a husband, right? And this is portrayed in movies and cinema and novels at this time. Married women working went up a little bit. There was definitely this kind of idea that more women would need to work in order to keep up with the consumer lifestyle. But again, 40% of Americans were living below middle class income and had to work. There wasn't necessarily a choice. A lot of the types of jobs in the 1920s meant that or were contingent on race and ethnicity. And there is a statistics sheet to explore that more in this module.